Welcome to On Point with Ron Gailey, where we meet with city leaders to discuss pressing issues, best practices, and ways that citizens and leaders come together to build their communities. City and municipal leaders have some of the toughest jobs in America. They are bombarded by expectations and conflicting demands. This podcast explores how successful leaders navigate that complexity. And now, your host, CEO and founder of On Point Insights, Ron Gailey.
We're live. Well, Ryan, good to have you here.
Yep.
I see the beautiful trees behind you. Is that the Ohio trees behind you?
Yeah, it's our big maple tree out back.
Is it really? Yeah, Ryan just moved to Ohio,
Ah.
Well, he was in Thailand much of the cold time of the year, but then now he's in Ohio. So how nice.
Ohio for the hot time of the year.
Yeah.
The 1 month where it's really hot.
Right.
Yeah.
Ohio's nice.
I'm from Ohio. So.
Oh, really?
You are, aren't you?
Yeah, I love Ohio, except for about 8 months out of the year where I don't love Ohio.
That's how I feel about Ohio.
Well, anyway, and also with us is Casey Lucius. You see her name down there. Casey is from Ohio, as she mentioned originally, but she's traveled much of the world, including spending time in Hawaii, in Vietnam, in California, now she lives in Florida, and along the way she got her master's degree and her PhD in political science. So it'll be fun to kind of talk with Casey. And actually, a lot of this discussion she'll be talking about her life because I don't know, it's just the way the topic of discussion goes today, where it's kind of a little bit more personal, and it'll be interesting to hear from Casey as she talks about her experience. But today, actually, we are very fortunate to have Casey with us because we're going to be talking about something that is unusual, I think, among the city managers and assistant city managers we've spoke to. Casey thought she wanted to talk about a piece of advice that she received in her life that made a big difference. And I just thought, wow, what a topic, advice you've received. And I bet you we could do that with nearly any city manager, but I'm glad you came up with it, Casey. And I'm glad we're going to talk about that today.
Thanks.
Tell us a little bit about what that advice was and, the setting.
Okay. So I was actually in college in Ohio at Ashland University, and one of my professors, whose name was Peter Schramm, he was the director of the Ashbrook Center and one of my mentors. I was talking to him and he asked me, what was I going to do when I graduated from college? And I remember telling him, I had these lofty goals. I was going to go work at the Pentagon and I was going to make policy and, I was going to run the national government. And I remember he just kind of laughed at me and said, no, you're not going to do that. You're 21 and 21-year-olds don't go to the Pentagon and make policy. So he said, he just kind of shook his head at me and he said, if you want to be extraordinary, be willing to do what no one else wants to do. So at the time, I don't know if I really made much of that piece of advice, but it definitely sunk in with me because later I didn't go to the Pentagon. I actually ended up after college going to officer candidate school and joining the Navy. And, not thinking about his advice, but I joined the Navy, went to intelligence training school in Virginia Beach. And after 6 months of intel training, I had about 25 people in our class, and the military detailer is the person who assigns you to your duty station. He comes in the room and he writes like 25 different duty stations on the whiteboard. And he says to the class, okay, there's 25 of you. There are 25 duty assignments. You guys figure it out, figure out where you're going to go. And there were great assignments there. There was Greenland and Hawaii and Spain. The Pentagon was on the list. And there were great assignments. And everyone was, arguing and picking which place they wanted to go. And there was one ship on the list. It was an aircraft carrier, and no one wanted to go to the ship. And that's when Dr. Schramm's advice popped in my head. If you want to be extraordinary, be willing to do what no one else wants to do. And I sat there thinking, okay, no one wants to go to the ship. So there's got to be something to this. I should go to the ship. So I raised my hand and volunteered to go to the ship. And I did. I spent 2 years on an aircraft carrier.
Now, did the detailer realize that nobody wanted the ship, and that, like, was this something that, or did he just think you wanted to go be on the ship?
I don't know. I don't know that he thought anything of it. But like clearly there was a deployment. You know, if you go on a ship, you're going to be deployed. And at that time they were deploying, this was before September 11th, but we were still deploying people to the Middle East and to Iraq. At that time we had sanctions against Iraq. And so I think the idea was whoever goes to that ship is going to be deployed to the Middle East. And that's probably why a lot of people didn't want it. I didn't know any better. So, so I thought, sure, 2 years on his ship, what can go wrong? so, yeah, I don't know that he really commented or thought anything, but it did come back around with that same detailer because, you know, fast forward.
Wait. Before we get to the detailer, tell us about this life on the ship. Like, what was that about?
It was fascinating, actually. It was, 5,000 people on an aircraft carrier. And an aircraft carrier is like a little town. You know, they have a store, they have a barber shop, they have a doctor's office, they have a dentist. Yeah, I mean, it's not like a luxury cruise. There's no bowling alley or movie theater or anything like that. But, I had a stateroom. I was an officer, so I had a stateroom that I shared. There were 4 of us, 4 women in a stateroom. And, and there's like a laundry room where you do your laundry and you work. You pretty much do nothing but work because there's nothing else to do. So you work very long days, 16, 18-hour days, and you work out and you eat and sleep. And that's about all there is to do. But, and as an intelligence officer, what I was doing specifically was we were implementing the oil for food program. So part of U.S. sanctions against Iraq was that if they sold oil, they had to use that money to buy food for the Iraqi people. And so we monitored all the oil that was coming out of Iraq on tankers. And then if there was illegal oil, we would detain those ships and inspect the ships and sometimes divert the ships to other countries. And it was just really fascinating to kind of see all of that take place and be a part of that. Be a part of UN sanctions. They weren't just US sanctions, it was United Nations. So to be part of foreign policy, like on a global level, was really, and I was, 21 years old. So it was incredible. It was really neat. So, and then I also was the division officer. So there was a division of enlisted intelligence specialists who worked for me. So that was also really my first job where I was in a manager or a supervisory position.
Right.
And had an opportunity to learn a little bit about leadership and motivating others, leading others. And so at a very young age, it was a really, really great work experience for me. So
But your 2 years came to an end.
My 2 years came to an end. And as it got close to that 2 years, you have to call the detailer and say, okay, I'm at the end of my tour, where do I go next? And when I called that same person who had walked into the classroom, he said, oh, I remember you. You were the only one who was willing to go to the ship. So now you get your first choice. Where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go to graduate school and I want the Navy to pay for it. And he said, okay. And he sent me to Monterey, California, where I went to the Naval Postgraduate School and got a graduate degree in National Security Affairs. The Navy paid for it. And I met my husband there. And I attribute that to taking that advice and just being willing to step up when nobody else wanted to step up and, be willing to take the tough job or the unknown job, and it paid off. So that's why I always tell people that's the best advice I was ever given.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And so when you were in getting your master's degree, was it just full-time school, just like nothing? You had no job responsibility?
Right. Yeah, that was my full-time job, to just go to school full time.
Well,
And I was just,
would that be a life? I mean, that's really great. In
oh, it was
Monterey,
wonderful.
California?
Yeah, it was wonderful. I lived in Monterey, California for 2 years and just went to graduate school full
Did you
time.
ever go
And
scuba diving out in Monterey? It's supposed to be great scuba diving there.
probably, but the water's too cold for me.
Oh.
Just in a
But
dry suit.
I did from there get to go to Hawaii, so where the water is much warmer. And a similar thing happened in Hawaii when I got to after getting my degree. The Navy sent me to Hawaii to the Pacific Fleet headquarters, and another thing happened where um, my boss, I worked for the uh, intel commander. He was a Navy captain, and he said, okay, the big boss, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, who's a 4-star admiral, wants an intel brief every morning at 7 a.m. So somebody's going to have to work overnight to gather all the information, compile it, analyze it, put it into a presentation, and brief him at 7 a.m. And, of course, nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to work, come in at midnight and work all night and prepare that. And again, it was just one of those moments where if you want to be extraordinary, be willing to do what no one else wants to do. And I just thought, okay, no one else wants to do this. I'll do it. And so I did that for 3 years, worked the night shift. And two really great things came out of that. One was that every morning I got FaceTime with not only my boss, but my boss's boss, and got to brief, again, international events, things that are going on all around the world that I got to brief a 4-star admiral on. And then the second really great thing that came out of it was I got off work in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, and I had the rest of the day free. And so I used my GI Bill and went to the University of Hawaii to get my PhD. And I probably wouldn't have been able to do that. I wouldn't have had the time to do that if I were working, sort of normal daytime hours. So that afforded me that opportunity to go to school for my PhD, which again, it just wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't been willing to take on that assignment.
Well, and an intelligence officer who every day got to do the briefing to the admiral. Like that, how cool is that? You probably knew things that, well, no one else knew except for you in leadership, right? Who got to get that daily briefing. Did
Yeah,
you
that was,
present that daily briefing live? Like, would you just go through it and present all the information?
yes, yes. So yeah, live in person, you know, it was great. So yeah, I felt like not only do I get to see the boss every day, but again, I'm also kind of privy to all this really great, you know, these global activities that are happening and national security activities and making recommendations for, foreign policy and military policy and military actions. And so, and, by this time I was, 25 or 26, I guess. And so again, just to have that opportunity at a young age was great, great training, great learning. And I attribute it all back to Dr. Schramm. So he changed my
You
life.
know, I guess it's unusual for anyone to say if you want to become extraordinary, do something no one else is willing to do, because there's the belief that you'll get caught doing all of the grunt work. You'll get stuck in a role where nobody wants to do that role, and that's your job. You know what I mean? But somehow that's not how it worked out for you.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in, in some cases I have gotten stuck doing the grunt work because it's the jobs that no one else wants. But I think, and I haven't always been the best at setting, boundaries for myself or saying no. But I guess that's because I always believe that if you perform well and you show your value, you won't be doing the grunt work for long because someone will see your capabilities and um, your value and your potential. So most of the time it has worked out well that being willing to just open up and do anything and see anything as an opportunity has always led to a greater opportunity.
Do you know, and as I think about it, if you are a person who has real potential and a great amount of capability, and I don't think it is something you would ever have to be afraid of, right? Because you can, you distinguish yourself by your willingness to serve, and you also show a little bit of humility that people really do value in people who are bright and capable, and oftentimes bright and capable people become manipulators, and they try to do, what I mean? They just try to force their way up rather than just distinguish themselves in other ways. I just think it's a great story.
Yeah, and I think that, and I use this, when I'm interviewing people and hiring people, I always think, someone may not have the exact experience you're looking for, or they may not have the right skill set or educational background that you're looking for. But if they have a learning mentality, if they're willing to try and learn and be open, I feel like, that's more important than having specific experience or education, because the learning mentality, pretty much, I believe, if you're willing to learn, you can learn to do any job. And so a lot of these things I get myself into, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to try.
So you're a city manager, you're an assistant city manager now. And
Right.
how in the world did you make the transition from the Navy,
Oh,
which is
that's
where you were at,
right.
to to your role in government, and local government? How did you make that transition?
Okay, so this is kind of a funny story. I I worked in federal government, so after I got out of the Navy, I worked for the State Department for a little while, and then went back to work for the Department of Defense as a civilian. So I worked in federal government for about 15 years, and in 2012, I ran for city council in a small town in California. And but let me give you the backstory. So my husband and I bought a house, our first home. We bought a little house, starter house in a small town called Pacific Grove, California. And a neighbor came to the door, like we had just moved in, and he said, "Will you sign this petition? We want to get a speed bump added to this street so people won't speed." And I thought, okay, I signed the petition. And about a week later, he comes back and he says, well, we got the signatures. Now we have to go present this to the traffic safety committee. Would you be willing to come to this meeting and, be with this group of people to present it? I said, oh, okay, sure. I'll go to the meeting and be part of this presentation. And then like a week later, he comes back to my door again and he says, well, I can't be there to make this presentation. Can you make the presentation to the traffic advisory committee? And so I said, well, okay, sure. I'll go and I'll present about the speed bump, like I've lived here 3 weeks and now I'm making a presentation about a speed bump. So I went to that meeting and did the presentation. And at the end of that meeting, a lady who was on the committee came up to me and she said, we have a vacancy on the traffic safety committee or whatever they were called. And she said, would you like to serve on our committee? And I thought, well, okay, sure. so so the next thing I'm on the advisory committee for the city to advise them on traffic safety issues. And I did that for a couple of years, I guess. So that must have been, I started that endeavor in like 2009 when we moved into the house. So did that for a couple of years. And then somebody said to me, you know, you've been so great on this committee. You should really run for city council. Like that's the next step. And so I thought, oh, okay, I'll run for city council. And so in 2012, I ran for city council and served on the local city council for 4 years till 2016. And I tell people that story because I say it just started with a speed bump. Like my entree into local government started with a speed bump, literally. And so when I was on city council, I really, really enjoyed being on city council, but I also learned something important about myself. So the city council makes policy, and I love policy, right? I studied political science. I got a PhD in political decision making. I love policy. But what I realized being on city council is, you know what I like more than policy is I like operations. I like doing the work. I like actually seeing things get done. I like the implementation. I like the outcomes. I like the metrics. I like the operational side. So after doing that for 4 years, I thought, as much as I enjoy the policy making part of it, I don't really have to be the decision maker. I like to execute. So, anyway, getting out of all of that, in 2016, I started doing some consulting with local governments in California. Then we moved to Florida. I did some consulting here in Florida for a few years. And then I landed with the city of Marco Island, which I love. And I love my job.
So fun. So fun. What a great experience. And I do think there's a lot of merit to saying if you want to be extraordinary, be willing to do the thing that others are not so willing to do. And in truth, you just became a servant, in my view, through it. And I just think people who are willing to become servants, when they have the capability of being a leader anyway, are like, it's really a wise move. That
Thank you.
servant leadership is a great role.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it sounds like I made some great sacrifice by taking on these roles, but actually, and maybe it was at the time, I don't know. I don't think of it that way, but I think ultimately ended up working out well for me. It worked out well for the organization that I worked for because it met their needs, but it also worked out really well for me because it always opened another door to an even better opportunity.
Yeah, a door to education, a door to meeting other leaders. Yeah, so smart.
And it's easy to be concerned that the payoff will be 5 or 10 years down the road, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna do a difficult job, something nobody wants to do, and maybe something good out of it will come in 10 years. But it seems like with your experiences, you were able to see how you're getting immediately rewarded, whether it was time with the boss or time for your education or all these things. And I think that takes a certain amount of optimism and perspective to see that there are immediate benefits to doing the difficult jobs, as well as
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think that's a really good point because a lot of times people think, oh, this might pay off in the long term, but I'm going to have to wait a long time for that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all perspective and attitude and what you make of it, I think, which is so much, so much in life, right?
Yeah.
No, I love it. Ryan, let's go in a little bit different direction here. Thinking of advice. If you had advice to give to someone, do you have anything in mind you'd tell someone? Like, what's the big learning in your life? And if somebody were graduating school or looking for a pathway upward, and they asked you what you thought, what would you tell them?
Well, one quote came to mind as we were having this discussion from Thomas Edison, that he said, "Opportunity is missed because it's dressed in overalls and looks like work." And so that's one thing, which is very similar to doing things that other people don't want to do, doing the hard work, and that is the opportunity. Instead of waiting for your big break or someone to just hand you what you want. You have to work for it. How about you, Ron? What do you have? Any advice to share?
If I had advice to give to someone, I think it'd be welcome change. And my core nature is I love things just running perfectly. I like to have this little environment where I have everything under control and I've got things in place. And change can be a little bit daunting. But when I think about my own life, like I had a great job that I was in, and the company I was with failed. And I found myself out of a job. And I was a senior leader making a great salary. And I'm going, wait a minute, I lost a job and what do I do now? And so of course you scramble and you look for opportunities. And ultimately, and I won't go through the full story because that's a story in and of itself, but ultimately I landed a job at Coca-Cola. And not only was it with Coca-Cola, like I was in banking. I went from banking to Coca-Cola. But not only was it with Coca-Cola, but it was in Asia. And I had no experience with Asia. And so I had a career change, industry change, geography change, meaning like an entirely different culture. And it was a huge impact in my life. But you know what? Like it was all the difference in my long-term happiness as a person, because like I was good where I was at, but I was more stagnant than I should have been. And I got pushed out of the nest, and this change forced upon me a lot, that like I became like, as far as the researcher goes, like on steroids better than I was before because of my experience with Coke. And then the time came when I needed to leave Coke. And I left Coke on good terms, but I left Coke and started my own company. And I had kind of wanted to start a company, but that was a big change. I had never run a company before. I had never, I had always been with the big company where the researchers came to us. I had never been at a company where like I had to figure this stuff out for myself, and like it was huge. It was huge to do that. And then the final change is this one. I had a city leader approach me at my own company, and he loved the work. He wanted to have the kind of thing we were producing, because when I was at Coca-Cola and when I was at the bank, like I learned how to do research in ways other researchers just don't know how to do, because I was helping senior leaders make decisions of these companies. And I learned how to do things that others just don't know how to do. So, and in my company, we were doing those things for companies, but a city leader wanted to have me help him with his survey, because he goes, look, I know cities, but I don't know research the way you know research. Would you help us? I said, well, I don't know cities. If you're okay with that kind of a gap, and he was okay. And we gave him a great product. It's the kind of thing I would have given to any of my senior leaders at the other companies that I was at. And he just loved it. But, I found that I loved helping city leaders. Like I loved that. And it was another change, because I abandoned like helping all the big companies, and I just said, I'm going to help city leaders. And I think all of those changes have strengthened me time over. So welcome change. And sometimes like, don't be afraid of it at all. But you just go for it, put your head down, make the best of that, whatever that moment is. But I'd say welcome change would be my other
I
one.
like that. I think that's good advice.
Yeah. Do you have another one, Casey?
Well,
what advice would you give to someone?
Yeah, I was thinking about, last summer we have a summer camp here on Marco Island at our Parks and Rec department. And I remember the parks manager called me, and she was having a hard time with the counselors, and the counselors are all college kids. And she said, the counselors are being more difficult than the little kids. And can you come and talk to them? And so I went there and I talked to them. And I remember I said to them, basically they were, I think, just being kind of dramatic and bringing their personal issues to the workplace and things like that. And so I talked to them and I asked them, we got all the counselors in a room, and I said to them, okay, what's your job here? And they said, oh, we're camp counselors. And I said, no, that's not your job. That's a title. And I said, what's your job? And they said, oh, our job is to keep the kids safe. I said, no, that's not your job. That's just a task. And, we went through this multiple times. I asked them, what is your job? What is your job? And they kept throwing things out. And I just kept saying, no, no, no. And finally, what I got to was, you have one job. And I think this applies to a lot of people, but definitely young people today who are just starting out, is I would say you have one job, and that is to make your boss's job easier. And then I went on to tell them, number one is don't bring drama to the workplace. Number two, bring solutions. Number three, welcome stress. Because a lot of times people say, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed out. But actually, stress, I think, refines us, it challenges us. And some people work well under stress. I'm not one of those people, but I do recognize that stress can be exciting and it can be energizing, and it can help you, force you to think clearly. So I said, okay, welcome stress. And then the final point was, ask for what you need. If you need resources, if you need something to do your job well, ask for it. People want you to succeed. You have to speak up and ask for what you need, but you can't be dramatic. You can't bring drama to the workplace. So I would say my advice would be, as you go into the workplace, or even as you continue in your current job, just keep that top of mind, that your job is to make your boss's job easier. And I think anybody who does that will be an asset in their city and their organization, and will be appreciated.
That's great advice. Very good. Ryan, did you have another one come to mind?
I was actually thinking, this is what Casey just shared, is something that my mission president told me, to bring solutions instead of problems when you talk to your boss, right? Because it's so easy for people to point out problems, and problems are usually immediately obvious. Things are breaking down, and the boss probably knows the problem before you do anyways, and so you pointing it out to them is often not very helpful unless you've thought about solutions. So at least think about solutions, or a deeper understanding of the problem. Ask questions like, what could be causing the problem? What are the mechanics of the issue? Sort of dissect it rather than just saying, hey, that's an issue, somebody should do something about that, right? So I agree with that. I think that's great advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably an issue every city manager faces, is everybody comes to the city manager and brings their problems, right? But what the city manager is looking for is someone to offer solutions, and then go run with it, right? Go take those solutions and implement
I think so.
them.
If they don't have to worry about what you're doing,
Right.
because they know you've got their back.
Well, and actually, that's a lot of what you do, Ron, is you, I think, help cities understand problems that exist and understand potential solutions, because you help, you have these focus areas in your surveys, and so you help cities do that and make the bosses' lives a lot easier. So
very cool. Well, thank you for that compliment.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Well, hey, any final words? Ryan, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I've just loved the discussion. I've loved hearing about Casey's experience. I've learned a lot.
Yeah. Casey, any final thoughts?
Thanks. Well, thanks for letting me drone on with some silly stories. But I'm glad. I'm really honored to be part of your podcast. And I think On Point is great. And I'm excited now that you have On Point podcast. And for me as assistant city manager, I always want to network with other city managers and assistant city managers. So for anybody who's listening to this, definitely keep City of Marco Island in mind, and let's connect.
Well said. And you'll love it if you do. And that's it. I don't have anything more here. So let's call it a close.
Yeah. Thanks, Casey.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you found this discussion valuable, please consider subscribing and sharing with others. If you have a topic or question you'd like to hear us discuss in our next episode, leave a comment or send us an email. It's podcast@onpoint-insights.com. See you next time.